Hey there guys, this is Mr. Herbst here, and today our focus is going to be on chapter 4.2, which is all about this concept called the lever. Now what is a lever? Well, a lever is a very simple machine that requires an input force and gives you an output force, like most other machines. It comes in three different classes based on the arrangement of where you have the output force compared to the input force and where we have this thing called the fulcrum. Now the fulcrum is the little area on a lever that allows the machine to pivot. So the fulcrum is where the actual lever goes up and down. If we're talking about a seesaw that you may have played on in the playground, it's that middle part that allows the seesaw to go up and down. So as I stated, there are three types of levers. The first kind is called a first class lever. That's where the fulcrum, which is pictured right here, is in the center or in between the output force and the input force. So it's sort of like a seesaw. An input force goes right here, pushes down on the lever, and then we get an output force right here. Another good example of first class lever is the pliers that I talked about in my last video. The fulcrum, or the pivot point, is right there in the middle of those pliers. The input force is where you squeeze, and then the output force is what you're squeezing on. Now, one thing that's really important to understand, and I did draw arrows to help you guys understand this a little bit, but the input force is down, but the output force is up. So I want you guys to see that the direction of forces is changed as a result of the first class lever. Now that's a little bit different than what happens in the second class lever. Direction does not change anymore. In a second class lever, the output force is all the way on the end of the stick. And the fulcrum, or the pivot point, is all the way on the other end. Now what's in the middle is the output force. And you can see that the input force and the output force are both in the same direction. So that's different than our first class levers. A good example of a second class lever is the wheelbarrow, where what do you do when you lift things up with the wheelbarrow? Well, you pull on the end of them right over here. The way that it pivots is right here at the wheel of the wheelbarrow, and then you get that output force right here. That's that load that you get to lift up with minimal exertion from you. So one thing that's really important to understand about the second class lever is that the output force is between the fulcrum and the input force. Once again, that's going to be different than it is in the third class lever. Maybe you can already understand what's going on, the pattern going on here. In a third class lever, we once again have our fulcrum attached on the end of the stick, but then here's what's kind of weird. The input force is actually between the output force and the fulcrum. A really good example of that is your forearm, or your upper arm and your forearm bones combined. Right here, your elbow is the fulcrum. That's the pivot point. Your bicep is the muscle that causes your arm to bend or to flex inward. The bicep is actually attached to the forearm, and when your bicep squeezes, it contracts your forearm, or contracts your arm upwards like this. So the input force is actually right here on the upper part of your forearm, and then the output force is whatever in your hand. Now you might be thinking, just based on this diagram, if you had a load or a heavy weight that was sitting on the end of a stick and you tried to pick it up from the middle part right over here, it doesn't really take a physicist to understand that that's going to be a pretty hard job. So the advantage that you get, or the mechanical advantage that you get, is less than 1, but you got to understand that at least there is something useful about this system, and that right there comes with the distance that the output load or the output force is actually moving. It doesn't take very much for the input force to cause a huge movement on the output force. We'll focus on that in class. Just understand that with a third class lever, that the input force is found between the output force and the fulcrum. This right here is once again the fulcrum. So here is all the three levers at a glance. First class lever, the fulcrum is between the output force and the input force. Second class lever, you have the output force in between the fulcrum and the input force. And in third class lever, you have the input force in between the fulcrum and the output force. So I would highly recommend writing down those simple concepts of each type of lever, each class of lever. Anyway, guys, this is Mr. Herbst, and I am signing off, but you all have a nice day.